The air in the second-floor supply closet tasted like cheap pine cleaner and stale dust. Fiona pressed her knuckles against her front teeth, biting down until the skin broke and tasted of iron. Just beyond the thin louvered door, something heavy hit the carpet with a sickening wet thud. Then came the footsteps. Slow. Heavy. The squeak of leather soles crossing the linoleum. When the closet door was wrenched open, she didn't scream. She simply stared at the fresh blood, soaking her boss's expensive cuffs waiting for the bullet. Friday evenings at the Crane Logistics building were usually a sanctuary of dead silence. The hum of the industrial HVAC system was the only company Fiona had, and she preferred it that way. The week had been a relentless grind of misfiled invoices and a payroll software update that had systematically rejected every overtime hour for the warehouse crew. She was tired, the kind of tired that settles in the marrow, making her shoulders ache and her eyes burn. She sat at her desk in the bullpen, bathed in the sickly blue glow of her monitor. The rest of the office was plunged into shadows, the overhead fluorescents timed to shut off at 6. It was past 9. She took a sip from her mug. The coffee had gone cold hours ago, leaving a bitter, acidic film on her tongue. Fiona wasn't supposed to be here. Victor Crane, the CEO, whose presence usually dictated the atmospheric pressure of the entire floor, had explicitly told everyone to go home at 5. He rarely spoke to her directly. His communications usually filtered through a labyrinth of senior management, but today he had walked past her desk, paused and told her to enjoy her weekend. His voice had been flat. His dark eyes entirely devoid of the polite warmth typical of corporate executives. It wasn't a suggestion, it was an order, but she had stayed. Rent was due, and she couldn't afford a docked paycheck because the software wouldn't cooperate. A sound broke her concentration. Not the HVAC. Not the distant rumble of a passing truck on the street below. It was a sharp, metallic ping. The elevator. Fiona froze. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, the cheap plastic keys suddenly feeling like landmines. The elevator shouldn't be running. The night security guard, an older man named Leon, who mostly slept in the lobby, always locked the elevators down at 8. She heard the heavy doors slide open, followed by a scuffle of boots on the marble foyer. It wasn't the measured, confident stride of Victor Crane. It was chaotic. Shouting, muffled, but aggressive, echoed down the main corridor. Fiona's heart hammered a frantic, irregular rhythm against her ribs. She lowered the brightness of her screen with trembling fingers and slipped out of her ergonomic chair. Her wool skirt caught on the edge of the desk, and she cursed silently, ripping it free. Just hide, her brain screamed. Don't look. Don't engage. She scrambled down the narrow aisle between the cubicles, her stockinged feet making no sound on the thin corporate carpet. The supply closet was at the end of the hall, a windowless 6x6 box filled with printer paper, industrial cleaning supplies, and a mop bucket that always smelled faintly of mildew. She slipped inside, pulling the heavy door shut until the latch clicked with a terrifyingly loud snap. Darkness swallowed her whole. Outside, the shouting grew louder. A man's voice, rough and strained, was pleading. The words were indistinct, slurred together in panic. Then a voice she recognized cut through the air. Victor Crane. His tone wasn't raised. It was calm, lethally calm. The same voice he used when dismantling a competitor's buyout offer in the boardroom. "You really thought the manifests wouldn't be checked?" Victor said, his words crisp and perfectly enunciated. Fiona backed up until her spine hit the cool metal shelving unit. A box of binder clips bit into her shoulder blade. She clamped her hands over her mouth, her breath coming in hot, rapid pants. "Victor, please, it was just a skim." The other man begged. The sound of a heavy blowflesh hitting flesh vibrated through the floorboards. The man groaned a wet, rattling sound that made Fiona's stomach pitch. "A skim is stealing from the pension fund," Victor replied, his footsteps moving closer to the closet. "You stole from my family." The word "a family" hung in the air, heavy and loaded. Everyone in the city knew the rumors about Crane Logistics. It was a front. A beautifully manicured, publicly traded front for a syndicate that had controlled the docks for 3 generations. Fiona had always ignored the whispers. She just processed the payroll. She didn't want to know. Now the reality was bleeding onto the hallway carpet. "I can put it back," the man sobbed. "I swear to God, God doesn't manage our accounts," Victor said. There was no cinematic monologue, no dramatic pause, just a dull, suppressed pop. It didn't sound like a gunshot in the movies. It sounded like a textbook being dropped flat onto a desk. The man hit the floor. The wet thud made Fiona's knees buckle, and she slid down the shelving unit, the metal grating scraping against her back. The sharp scent of bleach from the mop bucket suddenly felt nauseatingly strong, mixing with a new metallic odor creeping under the doorframe. Copper. Warm copper. Silence stretched thick and suffocating. Fiona squeezed her eyes shut, biting down on her knuckles. She waited for the sound of Victor walking away. She waited for the elevator to ping again. Instead, the squeak of leather shoes moved closer. The heavy measured steps stopped right outside the closet. The louvered slats of the door allowed thin slivers of ambient hall light to slice into the dark space. In one of those slivers, Fiona saw the shadow of a man standing perfectly still. He was breathing heavily now. Not panicked, just exerted. The brass doorknob turned. The mechanism clicked. Fiona stopped breathing. She braced for the blinding overhead light, for the gun, for the end of her painfully ordinary life. The door swung open. The light from the hallway wasn't blinding. It was just the dim yellow emergency bulbs that had flickered to life. Victor Crane stood framed in the doorway, a towering silhouette against the bleak glow. He didn't have his gun raised. In fact, Fiona couldn't even see a weapon. His bespoke navy suit jacket, the one that probably cost more than her car, was off. His white dress shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, the tie hanging loose. And his hands were ruined. The knuckles of his right hand were split and welling with dark blood, dripping slowly onto the polished linoleum. But it was the left side of his shirt that made Fiona's stomach knot. A jagged crimson stain was spreading rapidly, just below his ribs, soaking the crisp cotton. Victor stared down at her. He didn't look like a ruthless Mafia don who had just executed a thief. He looked exhausted. His dark hair, usually slicked back with militant precision, fell across his forehead in damp, sweat-soaked strands. Fiona remained frozen on the floor, her knees pulled to her chest, her knuckles still pressed against her lips. She expected a threat. She expected him to drag her out by her hair to eliminate the witness who had heard everything. Victor slowly blinked his dark eyes. He looked from her terrified face to the mop bucket, then to the shelves stacked with toilet paper and Windex. He let out a long, ragged sigh that sounded more like a death rattle. "Fiona," he said. His voice was gravelly devoid of its usual sharp edge. He didn't sound surprised to see her. He sounded inconvenienced. She couldn't speak. Her vocal cords were paralyzed. She managed a microscopic trembling nod. Victor leaned heavily against the doorframe, his left arm coming up to press against his bleeding side. He winced a sharp intake of breath, hissing through his teeth. "Top shelf. Left side." He muttered, his eyes slipping shut for a second before snapping open, fighting for focus. "There's a first aid kit, the industrial one. Fiona didn't move. Her brain was completely short-circuiting. The man had just killed someone 10 feet away. The dead man was lying right there, leaking onto the beige carpet, and the killer was asking her for bandages. "Fiona!" Victor repeated his voice, dropping an octave, carrying a warning tremor. "I am bleeding through a $1,200 shirt. Please." The absurdity of the request, grounded in such mundane corporate politeness, broke her paralysis. Her survival instinct, which had previously demanded she play dead, suddenly shifted gears. Obey. Just obey, and maybe he won't shoot you. She scrambled up her legs, feeling like overcooked noodles. She reached for the top shelf. Her hands shook violently, knocking over a box of staples, before her fingers closed around the heavy white plastic case of the trauma kit. She pulled it down and turned back. Victor hadn't entered the closet. Instead, he had slid down the doorframe and was now sitting on the floor in the hallway, his long legs stretched out in front of him. His head rested against the wall. He looked up at her from the floor. "Bring it here." Fiona stepped out of the closet. The smell of copper hit her like a physical blow. She forced herself to keep her eyes on Victor, deliberately avoiding the dark shape sprawled motionless near the water cooler. She knelt beside him, keeping a safe distance. She placed the kit on the floor between them and unlatched it. Her voice cracked, sounding like dry leaves. She cleared her throat. "I don't know what to do." Victor let his head loll to the side to look at her. "Open it! Get the shears! Cut the shirt!" She fumbled with the plastic latches. Her hands wouldn't stop shaking. She pulled out the heavy-duty medical scissors. "I'm not a nurse," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "And I'm not a patient," Victor retorted, his lips pulling back in a grimace. "Just cut the fabric. I need to see how deep the knife went." A knife. The scuffle she had heard before the gunshot. The dead man had fought back. Fiona leaned in. The scent of him was overwhelming, expensive sandalwood cologne sweat, and the sharp, raw smell of fresh blood. She reached out with the shears. Her fingers brushed against the warm skin of his stomach, where the shirt had pulled away. He flinched. Not a lot, just a microscopic tightening of his abdominal muscles, but it made her snatch her hand back, as if she'd touched a hot stove. "I won't bite, Fiona," he said, his voice a low rumble, "unless you stab me with those." It wasn't a joke, but the complete deadpan delivery in the middle of a slaughterhouse made a hysterical broken sound escape her throat. A half sob, half laugh. "Cut," he ordered quietly. She slid the bottom blade of the shears under the bloody cotton and snipped upwards. The fabric gave way easily. She peeled the ruined shirt back, exposing the wound. It was a vicious slice along his obliques, deep and bleeding sluggishly, but it didn't look like it had hit anything vital. Not that she actually knew. "Gauze," Victor instructed, his eyes studying her face rather than his wound. "A lot of it." And the medical tape. Fiona rummaged in the box, pulling out thick, square pads. She handed them to him, expecting him to do it himself. He didn't take them. His right hand was still dripping blood from the split knuckles, and his left was pressed flat against the floor to keep himself upright. "Press it down," he said, his gaze locking onto hers. It was a heavy, anchoring stare. She swallowed hard, tasting the metallic tang of her own fear. She took the thick wad of white gauze, leaned forward, and pressed it firmly against the open cut on his side. Victor let out a sharp hiss, his jaw clenching tight. His right hand twitched, coming up as if to grab her wrist, but he forced it back down to his knee. "Harder!" he gritted out. Fiona pushed down with both hands, putting her weight into it. She was kneeling inches from him. If she looked past his shoulder, she could see the dead man's shoes. So she kept her eyes glued to the pulse, beating rapidly at the base of Victor Crane's throat. "Why were you here, Fiona?" he asked softly, the violence in his eyes replaced by a cold, calculating curiosity. "I told everyone to leave. The payroll software," she stammered, her thumbs pressing deep into the gauze. "It crashed. The warehouse guys wouldn't get their overtime." Victor stared at her for a long, agonizing moment. The silence was broken only by his ragged breathing and the distant hum of the building's ventilation. "Overtime," he repeated, shaking his head slightly, a dark, cynical amusement dancing in his eyes. "You stayed in the dark on a Friday night, so a bunch of dock workers wouldn't lose $50. "They have rent," she whispered defensively, suddenly angry at his tone despite the terror. Victor looked down at her bloody hands pressed against his side. "You're a terrifyingly loyal employee, Fiona." Before she could process the weight of that statement, the elevator pinged again. The elevator pinged. It was a cheerful chiming sound designed to make corporate drones feel welcomed. Right now it sounded like a death knell. Fiona flinched, her instinct to bolt overriding her paralyzed terror. She yanked her hands back from Victor's side. The sudden release of pressure made him grunt a harsh, guttural sound. His large, blood-slicked hand shot out, clamping around her left wrist like a vice. His skin was burning hot. "Don't!" He hissed, his grip tightening until her bones ground together. "Stay exactly where you are." Heavy, purposeful footsteps spilled from the elevator banks onto the carpet. No shouting this time, just the rustle of synthetic fabric and the squeak of thick rubber soles. 3 men rounded the corner. They didn't look like hitmen from the movies. They looked like off-duty mechanics. The man in the lead, a stocky guy with a graying beard and a faded Mets windbreaker, stopped dead. His eyes snapped from the motionless body on the floor to Victor, then finally to Fiona. He didn't blink. His right hand dipped smoothly beneath his jacket, drawing a matte black pistol with terrifying casualness. The 2 men behind him mirrored the action. Fiona stopped breathing. She squeezed her eyes shut, waiting for the crack of the gun, waiting for the burning pain. "Put them away, Elias." Victor's voice cut through the stagnant air. It was strained, lacking breath, but it carried absolute authority. "Boss, the man in the windbreaker," Elias said slowly. He didn't lower the gun. Its muzzle remained fixed squarely on the bridge of Fiona's nose. "You have a civilian in the splash zone." "She's payroll," Victor replied, leaning his head back against the drywall. "And she's the only reason I'm not bleeding out onto the drywall." I said, "Put it away." A heavy silence stretched. Fiona opened one eye. Elias stared at her for a second longer, his expression completely blank, before holstering the weapon with a soft, metallic click. The others followed suit. "Barrett?" Elias asked, nodding toward the body. "Dead," Victor confirmed flatly. He pulled a blade before I could get an answer on where he stashed the ledger. "Messy." "We'll handle it." Elias gestured to the younger men. They moved forward with disturbing efficiency. Fiona remained kneeling, trapped between Victor's legs and the open supply closet. She watched, completely disassociated from reality, as one of the men pulled a heavy roll of thick plastic sheeting from a canvas duffel bag. The other man walked over to the supply closet, stepping right over Fiona's calves to do so, and grabbed the rolling metal cart usually used for distributing water jugs to the break rooms. The sound of duct tape being ripped from the roll tore through the quiet hallway. Scritch. Fiona knew that sound. She heard it every December when they boxed up the fiscal year's invoices for archiving. It was a mundane office supply sound. Now it was being used to bind the ankles of a man whose brown leather loafer had slipped halfway off his foot. Her stomach violently rebelled. Acid rushed up her throat. She slapped her hand over her mouth, swallowing hard against the bile. Victor felt her flinch. His fingers, still wrapped loosely around her wrist, shifted. He rubbed his thumb in a slow mechanical circle over her pulse point. It wasn't a comforting gesture. It was an assessment. He was monitoring her heart rate, checking to see if she was going to pass out and become a liability. "Look at me, Fiona," he commanded quietly. She couldn't. Her eyes were glued to the brown loafer. "Fiona, look at the tie." She forced her gaze up, tearing it away from the plastic sheeting, and locked onto Victor's chest. His tie, a dark silk knit, was ruined, soaked through with sweat and blood. "Keep pressing the gauze," he instructed, his voice dropping to a low murmur, meant only for her. "Don't look at them. Look at the fabric. Count the stitches. Do whatever it is you do when you audit a spreadsheet. Focus." She inhaled a shaky breath that tasted of copper and ozone. She leaned forward, pressing her hands back down onto the thick white pads over his wound. The blood was getting sticky now, tacking uncomfortably against her palms. Behind her, the rolling cart creaked under the sudden heavy weight of the plastic-wrapped bundle. The squeaking wheels receded down the hallway toward the freight elevator. Elias sprayed something onto the carpet that smelled strongly of artificial lemons and industrial enzymes. Fiona kept her eyes on the ruined silk tie. She counted the tiny woven squares. 1, 2, 3. She realized with a numb sort of horror that her entire life had fractured in the span of 30 minutes. Tomorrow was supposed to be grocery day. She needed to buy cat food. How was she supposed to buy cat food when she was sitting in a puddle of blood next to a Mafia boss? "It's done, boss," Elias said softly. Victor exhaled a long breath. He let go of Fiona's wrist and placed his own hand over the gauze, holding it in place. "Get up," he told her. Fiona scrambled backward, her knees popping. She wiped her bloody hands on her dark wool skirt, leaving wet, dark smears across her thighs. It was a useless, nervous tick. The blood was already under her fingernails. The hallway smelled overwhelmingly of fake lemons, entirely masking the iron scent of death. The damp patch on the carpet where Barrett had fallen looked like someone had just spilled a large coffee. In a few hours it would dry. By Monday morning, no one would ever know. Victor pushed himself off the floor, using the door frame for leverage. He bit back a groan, his face draining of whatever color it had left. He stood a full foot taller than Fiona, casting a long, jagged shadow across the linoleum. "Get your things," he ordered. He didn't yell. The volume of his voice never changed, but the weight of it pressed down on her lungs. Fiona didn't argue. Her legs moved on autopilot. She walked back down the narrow aisle of cubicles to the bullpen. Her computer monitor was now displaying a bouncing blue screensaver. Crane Logistics, delivering your future. The irony tasted like ash in her mouth. She grabbed her cheap faux leather purse from the bottom drawer and slung her wool coat over her arm. Her desk looked like an alien landscape. The half-empty coffee mug, the sticky notes reminding her to call IT, the framed picture of her tabby cat, Barnaby. It all belonged to a woman who didn't exist anymore. When she returned to the hallway, Victor was waiting by the private executive elevator. He had managed to shrug his suit jacket back on, buttoning it to conceal the bloody mess of his shirt. He looked pale, but entirely composed. He pressed the call button. The doors slid open silently. He stepped in and waited. Fiona hesitated. Getting into an elevator with a murderer felt like stepping into a coffin, but running meant he would have to chase her. And she knew with cold certainty that he wouldn't run. He would just send Elias. She stepped into the brushed steel box. The doors slid shut, sealing them in a humming fluorescent vacuum. Victor hit the button for the sub-basement. The descent was agonizingly slow. Fiona stared at her hands. The blood had dried into a stiff, rust-colored crust on her knuckles. It felt tight and itchy. She tried to rub it off, but it merely smeared against her skin. "There's a sink in the garage," Victor said, his eyes fixed on the changing floor numbers above the door. Fiona swallowed. "Okay." The elevator chimed and the doors parted, revealing the cavernous concrete expanse of the executive parking garage. The air here was frigid, smelling of damp cement, exhaust fumes, and tire rubber. A sleek black SUV idled near the elevator banks. A man in a dark suit stood by the rear door. Victor gestured with his chin toward a utility closet against the far wall. "Slop sink. 2 minutes." Fiona walked briskly toward the closet. She didn't run. Running would trigger a predator's instinct to hunt. She pushed open the door and found a deep industrial sink. She turned the cold water tap on full blast. She shoved her hands under the freezing stream, grabbing a rough block of pumice soap from the rim. She scrubbed frantically. The water swirling down the drain turned a violent murky pink, then slowly faded to clear. She scrubbed until her skin was raw and bright red, until the tight, itchy feeling of the drying blood was gone. But her hands still felt dirty. She dried them on her coat, shivering as the damp chill of the garage seeped through her thin blouse. She walked back to the SUV. The driver had the rear door open. Victor was already inside, leaning back against the headrest with his eyes closed. Fiona stood by the open door. Her apartment was only 6 blocks away. She could walk. She could walk away, go home, lock the door, and pretend she had just worked late. "Fiona," Victor said without opening his eyes. "Get in the car." She gripped the strap of her purse. "My apartment is on 4th Street. It's close. I can just—" "You aren't going to 4th Street," Victor interrupted, opening his eyes to look at her. The interior light of the car caught the sharp, unrelenting angles of his face. "Barrett was skimming for a rival outfit. They knew he was meeting me tonight. If he doesn't check in, they'll start looking. And they have access to the same employee database I do." Fiona's heart bottomed out, dropping heavily into her stomach. "They know who was in the building." Victor continued, his tone brutally pragmatic. "If you go home, Elias will be cleaning up your apartment by tomorrow morning. Get in the car." It wasn't a kidnapping. It was a hostage situation, masquerading as salvation. Fiona climbed into the back seat. The heavy armored door slammed shut behind her with a definitive airtight thunk. The interior smelled of expensive buttery leather gunpowder and the faint, lingering scent of Victor's sandalwood cologne. The driver pulled out of the garage, the tires squealing softly against the concrete. They merged onto the rain-slicked streets of the city. Neon lights blurred past the deeply tinted windows, distorted and smeared. Fiona pressed herself against the opposite door, as far away from Victor as the spacious cabin allowed. She stared out at the passing streetlights. A cynical, bitter laugh bubbled up in her throat, lodging there like a stone. The payroll software crashing had cost her $50 in overtime. And it had cost her her entire life. The SUV didn't stop at a clandestine, dimly lit warehouse. It glided into the subterranean parking structure of a gleaming glass and steel residential tower in the financial district. The garage here was entirely different from the brutalist concrete of the Crane Logistics building. It was aggressively illuminated by recessed LED panels, the air heavily filtered and carrying the faint scent of high-end car wax and ozone. When the driver, a broad-shouldered man whose name Fiona hadn't learned, opened the rear door, the silence of the garage pressed against her eardrums. Victor slid out first. He moved slower now. The adrenaline that had carried him through the murder and the subsequent cover-up was evidently evaporating, leaving behind the stark reality of a deep puncture wound. He kept his left arm clamped tight against his ribs, his breath shallow and strictly measured. Take her up, Victor told the driver, his voice a gravelly rasp. I need 2 minutes. The driver nodded, his expression giving away absolutely nothing. He stepped toward Fiona, extending a massive calloused hand to gesture toward a set of frosted glass elevator doors. It wasn't a request. Fiona climbed out. Her legs felt disconnected from her torso, functioning purely on mechanical memory. She followed the driver. Behind her, she heard the heavy thud of Victor, leaning back against the armored chassis of the SUV, followed by the metallic click of a specialized encrypted phone snapping open. He was making calls, managing the fallout. The elevator ride was soundless. No chiming bells, no display numbers. Just a smooth, stomach-dropping vertical pull. When the doors parted, Fiona stepped into a space that felt less like a home and more like a high-end architectural waiting room. The floor was dark, unpolished slate. The walls were expanses of cold grey concrete, broken only by floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the rain-streaked, glowing grid of the city. There were no photographs, no books, no clutter, just angular leather furniture and minimalist steel lamps. It was a sterile, unforgiving environment. Sit, the driver said, pointing to a sprawling black sectional sofa. Fiona didn't sit. Her skirt was still stained with wet, dark patches of Barrett's blood, and the thought of pressing that onto the pristine leather made her violently uncomfortable. She stood awkwardly near a massive slate kitchen island, hugging her cheap faux leather purse against her chest like a shield. The elevator doors opened again 3 minutes later. Victor stepped out. His color had gone from pale to a waxy, translucent gray. The driver immediately moved to his side, offering a shoulder, but Victor waved him off with a sharp, irritated flick of his wrist. "Hayes is 5 minutes out," Victor grunted, making his way past the sofa. He bypassed the comfortable seating, entirely pulling out a rigid, steel-framed bar stool at the kitchen island. He sat heavily, his boots scuffing the slate. He finally let his left arm drop away from his side. Fiona stared. The blood had completely saturated the thick wads of gauze, soaking through the hastily buttoned jacket and dripping slowly onto the floor. Victor caught her looking. His dark eyes, though clouded with pain, were still alarmingly sharp. "Down the hall, first door on the left," he said, his chin jerking toward a dark corridor. "Wash your hands, Fiona. You look like a butcher." She didn't argue. She turned and walked down the hall, her stockinged feet making soft, pathetic slapping sounds against the stone. The bathroom was the size of her entire apartment living room. The floor was heated, a sudden shocking warmth against her freezing toes. She locked the heavy wooden door, the click of the deadbolt offering a microscopic, utterly false sense of security. She walked to the floating marble vanity and turned on the faucet. The water ran over her hands. It was scalding hot. She didn't adjust it. She grabbed a heavy square bar of French milled soap and began to scrub. She washed her hands, then her wrists, then her forearms. She watched the pink-tinted suds swirl down the brushed nickel drain. When the water finally ran clear, she looked up into the mirror. Her brown hair was a static-filled mess. Her mascara had smudged beneath her eyes, making them look hollow and bruised. But it was the complete blankness in her expression that terrified her the most. She had just watched a man die. She had had her hands inside another man's open stab wound. And yet she wasn't crying. Her tear ducts felt completely dry, parched by the sheer, overwhelming voltage of shock. A heavy knock on the apartment's front door echoed down the hall. Fiona turned off the water. She grabbed a thick, plush hand towel, drying her skin until it was red and chafed. She pressed her ear against the bathroom door. She heard muffled voices. Victor's low rumble, the driver's clipped tones, and a new voice older, brisk, and entirely too calm. Dr. Hayes. Then came the sounds of tearing fabric, the clatter of metal instruments being dropped onto the slate countertop, a sharp, violent hiss of breath from Victor, followed by a low, guttural string of profanities. The sharp, medicinal stench of surgical spirit and iodine seeped under the bathroom door, completely obliterating the expensive scent of the milled soap. It smelled like a hospital. It smelled like damage. Fiona slid her back down the door, sinking to the heated floor tiles. She pulled her knees to her chest. She needed to feed Barnaby. She had left his bowl only half full this morning. If she didn't go home, he would start eating the leaves off her spider plant, and then he would throw up on the rug. The absurdity of the thought finally broke something loose. A single jagged sob tore its way up her throat. She clamped both hands over her mouth, biting down hard on the fleshy part of her palm, trapping the sound inside. Fiona stayed on the bathroom floor for nearly an hour. She measured the time by the sounds filtering through the heavy door. The snipping of medical scissors, the low, urgent cadence of the doctor's instructions, the agonizingly long stretches of silence where she imagined Victor passing out or dying, leaving her trapped in this sterile, concrete box with his goons. Finally, the metallic click of a latch closing snapped her to attention. A heavy medical bag zipping shut. Footsteps moving toward the front door. Low murmurs of farewell, and then the solid hydraulic seal of the elevator doors sliding shut. Silence descended on the apartment, thick and ringing. Fiona slowly got to her feet. Her joints were stiff, her muscles coiled so tight they ached. She unlocked the bathroom door and eased it open, wincing at the small squeak the hinges made. The main living area was dim. Only the ambient glow from the city lights outside illuminated the room. The bloody gauze, the ruined suit jacket, the shredded remnants of the silk tie, it was all gone. The slate kitchen island was wiped spotless. Victor was sitting on the black leather sofa. He wasn't lying down. He sat rigidly upright, his broad shoulders squared. He had changed. He wore a simple dark grey t-shirt and loose black sweatpants. The casual clothing felt intensely jarring, completely at odds with the ruthless corporate predator she was used to seeing. He held a short crystal tumbler in his right hand. The ice clinked softly against the glass as he swirled the amber liquid inside. "Come out, Fiona," he said. He didn't look back at her. He was staring out the window at the rain. "The coast is clear. The monster is patched up." The cynical, self-aware edge to his voice made her stomach tighten. She stepped out of the hallway, hovering near the edge of the living room rug. She felt entirely exposed without her coat, her stained wool skirt, and wrinkled blouse clinging uncomfortably to her damp skin. Victor finally turned his head to look at her. The grey pallor was gone from his face, replaced by a harsh, exhausted tightness around his jaw. The painkillers the doctor had undoubtedly pumped into him were working, glazing his dark eyes with a slight, glassy sheen, but his focus remained predatory. He gestured to the empty space on the sofa with his glass. "Sit." "I prefer to stand," she said. Her voice was raspy, completely stripped of its usual professional deference. Victor stopped swirling his drink. The ice settled with a quiet clack. "You're vibrating, Fiona. You're going to pass out, hit your head on my coffee table, and then I'll have to explain to Hayes why he needs to come back and stitch up my payroll clerk. Sit down." She realized he was right. Her knees were trembling so violently they were practically knocking together. The adrenaline crash had finally caught up to her, bringing with it a deep, bone-rattling chill. She walked over to the sofa, keeping as much distance between them as the furniture allowed. She sat perched on the very edge of the cushion, her spine ramrod straight, her purse clutched in her lap. Victor watched her carefully. He took a slow sip of his drink. The The smell of high-end bourbon drifted over the lingering scent of iodine. Barrett. Victor stated his voice flat, dropping the dead man's name into the room like a lead weight. He was funneling our manifests to a crew operating out of the south side. They were hitting our trucks before they even reached the interstates, costing us millions. Fiona stared at her white knuckles. I processed the payroll, Mr. Crane. I don't care about the manifests. Victor, he corrected quietly. If you're going to scrub my blood off your hands, you can use my first name. She didn't reply. A violent shiver racked her frame, making her teeth click together audibly. Victor sighed. It wasn't a sympathetic sound. It was the weary exhale of a man dealing with endless logistical annoyances. He reached over the back of the sofa and grabbed a heavy dark grey wool throw blanket. He didn't drape it over her shoulders with gentle romantic care. He simply tossed it at her in a crumpled heap. "Put that on," he ordered. "Shock is setting in." Fiona unravelled the heavy wool and pulled it tightly around her shoulders. It smelled faintly of his sandalwood cologne and dry cleaning chemicals. It was warm. The small comfort made her throat ache with sudden, humiliating tears. But she refused to let them fall. "Why didn't you let me go home?" she asked, her voice cracking. "I wouldn't have said anything. I didn't see anything. I just heard it." "You saw me bleeding out in a closet," Victor replied bluntly. "You helped me. That makes you involved." "No, it doesn't. It makes me a hostage who didn't want to get shot." A sharp, humorless bark of laughter escaped Victor's chest. He immediately winced, his left hand coming up to hover over his ribs. "God, don't make me laugh. The stitches are tight." He leaned his head back against the leather, staring up at the ceiling. "I didn't keep you here to torture you, Fiona," he said, the amusement draining away, leaving only cold facts. "Barrett was stupid, but the people backing him aren't. They knew he was meeting me tonight. They knew the security rotation. And if they pull the building's server logs before my tech guys finish wiping them, they'll see your keycard swiped in at 8:15 a.m. and never swiped out." Fiona felt the blood drain from her face. "They won't come after me right away." Victor continued, turning his head to lock eyes with her. "They'll look for leverage. They'll look for the weak link in the chain of events. A civilian witness who lives alone in a fourth-floor walk-up with a broken lobby lock is exactly the kind of loose thread they pull on to see what unravels." He took another sip of bourbon. "You aren't a hostage," he said softly, the weight of the city pressing against the glass behind him. "You're in protective custody." Fiona pulled the wool blanket tighter, her fingers burying into the thick fibers. The cynical reality settled over her like a shroud. She wasn't an employee anymore. She was a liability, wrapped in expensive wool, sitting on the sofa of a murderer. Morning broke over the financial district, not with a gentle dawn, but with a harsh, blinding glare reflecting off 1,000 glass facades. The light sliced through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse, striking Fiona directly in the eyes. She woke with a violent jolt, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs before she even remembered why she was terrified. Her neck was agonizingly stiff. She had fallen asleep sitting up on the black leather sectional, huddled beneath the heavy wool throw. Her mouth tasted of stale copper and dehydrated panic. Her clothes, the blood-stained wool skirt, and the wrinkled, damp blouse felt like a layer of grime, permanently bonded to her skin. She sat up slowly, her spine popping. The apartment was silent, save for the low, aggressive hum of a high-end espresso machine in the kitchen. Fiona pushed the blanket off her shoulders and stood. Her legs were shaky, her knees feeling like hollow glass. She padded softly across the slate floor toward the kitchen, wrapping her arms around her stomach. Victor was there. He had his back to her, leaning heavily against the granite countertop. He was wearing the same dark grey t-shirt and sweatpants, but his posture was rigid, favouring his left side. He held a tiny porcelain espresso cup in his right hand. The mundane normalcy of the scene felt deeply offensive. The man had executed an employee, bled over a supply closet, and effectively kidnapped her. Now he was brewing imported coffee. "You're awake," Victor said. He didn't turn around. The reflection in the black glass of the oven door gave him away. "Where is Elias?" Fiona asked. Her voice was raspy, stripped of any professional filter. It was the voice of a woman who had absolutely nothing left to lose, save for her immediate survival. Victor slowly rotated to face her. The morning light was brutal on his features, highlighting the deep, bruised circles under his eyes, and the tight, pain-pinched lines around his mouth. He looked awful. It brought Fiona a tiny vindictive spark of satisfaction. "Elias is running an errand," Victor replied, taking a sip from the tiny cup. "He'll be back shortly." Fiona gripped the edge of the kitchen island, the cold stone biting into her palms. "What errand?" Victor set the cup down with a sharp clink. He looked at her, his gaze sweeping over her dishevelled hair, her smeared makeup, and the dark, rust-coloured stains mapping her skirt. "He went to your apartment. 4th floor walk-up, broken lobby lock. Just like you said." The air vanished from Fiona's lungs. Her fingers dug into the granite until her knuckles turned bone-white. "You sent him to my home." "I sent him to pack a bag." Victor corrected his tone, flat and pragmatic. "You can't wear the same clothes for the next 2 weeks. It's unhygienic, and frankly, you look like a crime scene." 2 weeks. The words tumbled out of her mouth, weak and breathless. "Give or take, until I find out exactly how much data Barrett leaked to the Southside crew. Until I know they don't have a manifest with your name and home address on it." The reality of the situation crashed over her heavier and colder than the night before. This wasn't a temporary delay. It was a complete derailment. She was locked in a concrete tower with a wounded predator, and his enforcer was currently rifling through her underwear drawer. Then a sharper, more desperate thought pierced the panic. "Barnaby," she blurted out. Victor frowned, a microscopic tightening of his brow. "Who?" "My cat." Fiona's voice cracked the pitch, rising dangerously. "Barnaby. He's in the apartment. I didn't feed him dinner. I didn't leave enough water out. If Elias opens the door, he might run out into the hall, and the super's pit bull is always loose on the stairs." "Fiona." Victor interrupted his voice, a low, warning rumble. "Breathe." She couldn't. The trauma of the previous night had been too massive, too incomprehensible to fully process. A murder was abstract. A gunshot was cinema. But her tabby cat starving in a locked apartment, or being chased by a dog because a Mafia hitman left the door open, that was real. That was a tangible, unbearable tragedy. Her chest heaved. The edges of her vision began to blur with dark static. She backed away from the counter, her hands flying up to grip her own hair. "He's going to let him out," she gasped, the panic fully taking over. "He doesn't know to block the gap with his foot. Barnaby is fast. He'll bolt." Victor exhaled a harsh breath through his nose, wincing as the movement pulled at his stitches. He reached into his pocket, pulled out the encrypted cell phone, and hit a single button. He put it on speaker and tossed it onto the granite counter. It rang exactly once. "Yeah, boss," Elias's gruff voice filled the pristine kitchen. In the background, Fiona could hear the distinctive screeching sound of her bedroom window being opened. "Elias!" "Report," Victor demanded. "I've got a duffel packed. Clothes, toothbrush, some toiletries." Wiped down the hard drive on her laptop and took it. Checked the perimeter. No signs of surveillance. "And the animal?" Victor asked, his eyes locked firmly on Fiona's pale, trembling face. There was a heavy pause on the other end of the line. Then a loud, angry roar echoed through the speaker. "Yeah," Elias grumbled, sounding profoundly irritated. "I got the cat. The little bastard took a chunk out of my wrist, but I got him in the plastic box." Fiona's knees buckled. She sank toward the floor, but caught herself on the edge of the stool, dragging in a massive, shuddering breath of air. "Bring it," Victor said, and disconnected the call. He didn't offer a word of comfort. He just picked up his espresso, his dark eyes analyzing her breakdown with cold, calculating precision. 30 minutes later, the hydraulic hiss of the private elevator announced Elias's return. Fiona was standing perfectly still in the center of the living room, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. The moment the frosted glass doors parted, the smell hit the sterile air of the penthouse. It was the distinct, powdery scent of cheap, lavender-scented cat litter and fish-based kibble. Elias stepped out. He looked exactly as he had last night. Faded Mets windbreaker, thick rubber-soled boots, except now a dark red scratch traced an angry line across the back of his right hand. In his left hand, he carried a faded green canvas duffel bag. In his right, he lugged a battered plastic pet carrier. Inside the carrier, a low, continuous growl rumbled like a broken lawnmower. Elias dropped the duffel bag onto the slate floor with a heavy thud. He set the carrier down next to it, glaring at the plastic grating. "Psycho," he muttered under his breath. Fiona didn't look at Elias. She dropped to her knees, the hard stone sending a shockwave of pain up her bruised shins. She scrambled toward the carrier, her fingers fumbling with the metal latch. "Don't open it," Victor commanded from the kitchen island. Fiona froze, her hand resting on the latch. She looked up. Victor was leaning against the counter, watching her with a dark, unreadable expression. "He's terrified," Fiona said, her voice shaking but defiant. "He's been in there for an hour. He hates cars. He's an animal in a strange environment." Victor countered his tone perfectly, even devoid of any empathy. "If you open that door, he'll bolt under the nearest piece of furniture and piss on a custom leather sofa. Leave him in the box until he calms down." Fiona stared at Victor. He wasn't yelling. He was simply stating a rule of the house. It was the same tone he had used to order Elias to put away his gun the night before. Absolute authority. She looked down at the carrier. Barnaby's large, dilated green eyes stared back at her from the shadows of the plastic box. He let out a pathetic, high-pitched mew that cracked her heart straight down the middle. "I won't let him ruin your things," she whispered, her voice tight with suppressed rage. She unlatched the metal door and pulled it open. Barnaby didn't bolt. He crawled forward on his belly, his orange tabby fur plastered flat against his skin, making him look half his normal size. He crept out of the box and immediately pressed his side against Fiona's thigh, shivering violently. Fiona gathered him up. He weighed 15 pounds, a heavy, warm, shedding mass of anxiety. She buried her face into his fur. He smelled like dust and the comforting, mundane reality of her small apartment. The dam broke. She hadn't cried when Barrett was shot. She hadn't cried when she was washing a dead man's blood off her hands in the freezing garage sink. But sitting on the cold floor of a multi-million-dollar penthouse, holding a terrified tabby cat, the tears finally came. It wasn't a delicate cinematic weeping. It was ugly. Her shoulders heaved with sharp, ragged sobs. Her nose ran. She hid her face in Barnaby's neck, the coarse fur scratching against her damp cheeks, muffling the humiliating sounds she couldn't stop making. Elias stood awkwardly near the elevator, shifting his weight from one boot to the other. He looked at Victor, a silent question hanging in the air. Victor gave a slight dismissive jerk of his chin. Elias nodded, turned, and disappeared back into the elevator, the doors sealing shut behind him. Fiona sat on the floor, rocking, slightly crying, until her throat felt raw and her head pounded with a vicious, throbbing ache. She expected Victor to yell. She expected him to demand she stop making a scene, to remind her that he was the one with the knife wound, that she was just a civilian liability. Instead, there was only the sound of his boots scuffing slowly against the slate. He stopped a few feet away from her. The heavy silence stretched, broken only by her jagged breathing and Barnaby's nervous purr. A shadow fell over her. A white rectangular object drifted down into her line of sight, landing softly on the slate floor next to her knee. A travel pack of tissues. Fiona slowly lifted her head. Her face was blotchy, her eyes red and swollen. Victor was looking down at her. He wasn't sneering. He wasn't offering a comforting smile either. His expression was a study in detached observation, but the harsh, predatory edge was gone. He looked tired. Deeply, fundamentally tired. "The guest room is the last door at the end of the hall," Victor said quietly. His voice echoed slightly in the vast, empty room. "There's an attached bathroom. The bag Elias brought has your things. Take the animal. Close the door. Sleep." He turned and walked back toward the kitchen, his left arm coming up to brace his injured side. Fiona wiped her nose with the back of her hand, smearing her makeup further. She looked at the green canvas duffel bag Elias had dropped. A corner of a pink, faded t-shirt, the one she usually wore to sleep, was sticking out of the zipper. She could smell her cheap strawberry-scented shampoo wafting from the canvas. It was a violent intrusion, an invasion of her private life dumped onto the floor of a criminal's fortress. She picked up the tissues, tightened her grip on the heavy shedding cat, and grabbed the strap of the duffel bag. She didn't say thank you. She didn't look back at the kitchen. She just walked down the long, dark corridor, seeking the only thing left she could control: a locked door. The heavy wooden door closed with a solid, airtight thunk. Fiona twisted the thumb-turn lock until it clicked. It was an illusion of safety, a flimsy barrier against a man who commanded killers, but her brain desperately needed the physical boundary. The guest room was a continuation of the penthouse's sterile, brutalist aesthetic. Charcoal grey walls, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the rain-lashed skyline. A massive bed covered in stiff, bleached white linens that looked more like a surgical drape than a place to sleep. There was no art, no television, no clutter, just a sprawling expanse of expensive, unfeeling space. Barnaby wriggled free from her exhausted grip. He hit the slate floor with a soft thump and immediately began a low-to-the-ground perimeter sweep, his nose twitching frantically as he catalogued the alien alkaline smells of the room. Fiona dropped the green canvas duffel onto the floor. She sat on the very edge of the mattress. It didn't yield. It was violently firm. She stared at her hands. The pumice soap in the garage had removed the surface blood, but in the harsh overhead light, she could still see the faint, rust-colored stains trapped deep within the cuticles of her fingernails. She unzipped the duffel. Elias had packed with the terrifying efficiency of a man who routinely erased people's lives. Her cheap strawberry-scented shampoo was shoved alongside 3 pairs of sensible cotton underwear, a pair of jeans, her toothbrush, and a crumpled heap of her sleepwear. She pulled out her favorite t-shirt. It was faded to a sad, pale pink, the fabric pilling at the collar. Holding the cheap cotton in this multi-million-dollar fortress felt absurd. It was a tangible piece of her mundane, perfectly boring reality, completely at odds with the bullet holes and plastic-wrapped bodies of the last 12 hours. She stripped off the ruined wool skirt and the damp, sour-smelling blouse, leaving them in a heap on the floor like shedding a diseased skin. The attached bathroom offered a walk-in shower encased in seamless glass. Fiona turned the water on full blast, waiting until steam billowed against the ceiling. She stepped in. The scalding water hit her shoulders like a physical blow. She grabbed her cheap shampoo, lathering it aggressively into her hair until the thick, artificial strawberry scent completely overpowered the faint, lingering smell of copper and iodine. She scrubbed her skin until it burned, trying to wash away the phantom sensation of Victor's hot blood against her palms. The wet sound of Barrett hitting the carpet, the terrifying squeak of the rolling water cart. When she finally stepped out, wrapping herself in a towel so thick and heavy, it felt like a weighted blanket. The frantic, buzzing energy of shock had burned off. What remained was a hollow, echoing exhaustion. She pulled on the pink t-shirt and a pair of worn-out flannel pajama pants. She towel-dried her hair, leaving it in a damp, tangled knot at the nape of her neck. In the bedroom, Barnaby was sitting by the door, letting out a sharp, demanding yowl. Fiona dug into the bottom of the duffel bag and pulled out the heavy plastic bag of cheap, fish-flavored kibble. She tore it open. Barnaby head-butted her shin, his purr rumbling loudly. But as she looked around the pristine room, the problem became obvious. Elias had packed the food, but he hadn't packed the bowls. She couldn't dump oily kibble onto the slate floor, and she couldn't let Barnaby starve simply because she was too paralyzed to leave the room. She squeezed her eyes shut, fighting a fresh wave of tears. She was so tired, she just wanted to sleep. But the cat was weaving between her ankles, crying. Fiona took a deep breath, unlocked the door, and pulled it open. The hallway was dark. The only light came from the kitchen at the far end of the sprawling living room. The espresso machine was silent. The only sound was the rhythmic drumming of rain against the massive windows. She crept down the hall, keeping her back pressed against the cool plaster of the wall. She clutched the bag of kibble to her chest like a shield. When she reached the edge of the kitchen, she stopped. Victor was still there, but he wasn't standing anymore. He was sitting on the floor behind the granite island, his back braced against the sleek, black metal panels of the custom cabinetry. His long legs were splayed out in front of him. His eyes were closed, his head tilted back. A small amber pill bottle sat on the floor beside him, next to the half-empty crystal tumbler of bourbon. Fiona froze. Her instinct screamed at her to retreat, to lock herself back in the charcoal room and pretend she hadn't seen the predator wounded in his den. But as she watched, Victor's chest hitched. A short, ragged breath escaped his lips, sounding dangerously close to a wet wheeze. The dark grey t-shirt was pulled tight across his torso, and Fiona could clearly see a fresh, dark stain spreading just above his waistband. He was bleeding again. Her cynical payroll clerk brain kicked into gear, cutting through the fear with cold logic. If he bled out on the kitchen floor, she was alone in a penthouse, with no keys, no phone, and a hitman named Elias, who would undoubtedly view her as a loose end. Her survival was tethered entirely to the beating heart of the man slumped against the cabinets. She didn't retreat. She stepped fully into the kitchen, the bag of cat food crinkling loudly in the quiet space. Victor's eyes snapped open. The glassy, pain-hazed look was still there, but the raw instinct was immediate. His right hand twitched toward his hip, seeking a weapon he wasn't wearing. "I need a bowl," Fiona said. Her voice was flat, devoid of a tremor. Victor stared at her. He blinked slowly, his eyes tracking over the damp hair, the ridiculous pilling pink t-shirt, and the worn flannel pants. He looked completely disoriented by her presence, as if a ghost had just walked into his kitchen, demanding dishware. He didn't speak. He just let his head fall back against the cabinets, with a heavy thud, his chest rising and falling in shallow, painful increments. He raised his right hand, making a weak, sweeping gesture toward the upper cabinets to his left. Fiona walked past him. She could smell the bourbon, the sweat, and the fresh blood. She opened a cabinet, found a stack of delicate, bone-white porcelain saucers, and took two. She knelt on the floor a few feet away from him. She poured a handful of kibble into one saucer and filled the other with water from the refrigerator dispenser. Victor watched her through half-closed eyes. "You came out of the panic room," he rasped, his voice rough as sandpaper, "for a saucer." "He has to eat," Fiona replied simply. She looked at the spreading stain on his shirt. "You're bleeding through the dressing." "I pulled a stitch," he muttered, closing his eyes again. "When I sat down, it'll clot." He sounded like a man arguing with a spreadsheet, stating facts he fully expected to balance themselves out. Fiona stood up, holding the two saucers carefully. She looked down at the Mafia boss, stripped of his expensive armor, bleeding on his own kitchen floor. "You should probably drink some water," she said, quietly, turning on her heel. She didn't wait for an answer. She walked back down the dark hallway, leaving him to the silence and the shadows carrying a porcelain dish of cheap cat food back to her cage.